My Lords, in moving Amendment 1, we return to an issue which we debated at the report stage of this bill back in June. The amendment, Amendment 1, seeks to prevent companies from using United Kingdom's telecommunications infrastructure to facilitate human rights abuses, to the extent that use of the infrastructure or any part of it brings in the supply chain. This seeks to engage the transparency and supply chain provisions of the Modern Slavery Act 2015. My Lords, exactly 1 year ago, I asked the government what assessment it had been able to make of the implications of their decision to award contracts to Huawei and other companies required under China's national intelligence law to support, assist and cooperate with that state's intelligence work. And I also asked about Huawei's compliance with the 2015 Modern Slavery Act and what consideration they've given to such compliance in regard to their decision to award contracts to Huawei. In January last year, the government deftly avoided answering my question by simply saying, and I quote, that it had expressed its concerns about China's systematic human rights violations in Xinjiang, including credible and growing reports of forced labour. Throughout the previous 2 years, in 2018 and 19, I'd raised my concerns about some of the shocking events unravelling in Western China, a region in which I have travelled. In August 2019, for instance, I asked the government what assessment it had made of reports the United Kingdom investors hold shares totalling £800 million in companies that supply CCTV and facial recognition technology being used to track Uighur Muslims in Xinjiang. Although aware of the reports, the government said it had, quotes, not undertaken analysis of British investor shareholdings in Chinese surveillance companies. I wonder, my Lords, whether that is still the situation, and perhaps when the Noble Baroness, the Minister, comes to reply, she will tell us. My dissatisfaction with those replies, and in the context of my involvement in the legislative stages of the 2015 Act, my pro bono role as a trustee of the charity Arise and as vice chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on Uyghurs, prompted me to speak at committee stage of this bill on May the 19th and again on June the 29th at report stage when I moved an all-party report stage amendment to this bill. The co-sponsors of that bill, one was the Noble Lord, Lord Adonis, who is in his seat today, the Noble Lord, Lord Faulkner, Noble Lord, Lord Forsyth, and my noble friend, Baroness Faulkner, will also, I think two of them will be speaking in this group of amendments. In a series of powerful speeches, though, my Lords, right from across the chamber, and with only one partially dissenting voice, members of your Lordship's House made clear their deep anxiety that the government was ready to hand over up to 35% of our G5 infrastructure to Huawei, a company which actively partners with the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang, where 1 million Uyghurs are incarcerated and used as slave labour. It drew parallels during the course of that debate with the way in which companies like Siemens had used labourers in Nazi concentration camps to build their industrial empire, and the similar way in which Stalin used Gulag labour to power his economic programmes on the back of those who had been incarcerated. In June, the Noble Baroness asked us not to divide the House, but said she would be willing to return at third reading today with an amendment to provide a human rights threshold which companies would be required to meet. It was also suggested that the Telecommunications Security Bill would be a more appropriate piece of legislation on which to attach an amendment. I'll be grateful when the Noble Baroness comes to reply whether she can confirm that the title of that bill has been drawn in such a way as to actually exclude that possibility. But, my Lords, since June, meetings have been held with the Noble Baroness and with ministers from the Departments of Trade, the Home Office and the Foreign Office. And the debate also triggered a determination to lay further amendments both to the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill and to the Trade Bill. I know that the Noble Baroness, the Minister, has genuinely and faithfully tried her very best to honour the commitment that she gave the House in June, and I really am grateful to her and for the time and trouble that she has taken throughout. Let me remind the Government and the House why this issue isn't going to go away quietly and why the House will have a chance on Tuesday next to demonstrate that. academics have described Xinjiang as the world's most shocking example of state-sanctioned slavery. At committee stage of this bill, I drew the government's attention to the work of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and quoted the Institute's Vicky Xu, who said that the idea that Huawei is not working directly with the authorities in Xinjiang is just straight-up nonsense. I sent the Noble Baroness the Minister a video recording of shackled and blindfolded Uyghur Muslims being led from trains to camps. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, whose own family suffered the grotesque horrors of the Shoah, commemorated again yesterday on Holocaust Memorial Day, said that such scenes were, his words, reminiscent of something not seen for a long time. I know that the Noble Baroness shares the sense of revulsion that we have all felt on learning of forced sterilizations and forced abortions of Uyghur women to prevent births within their community, of the desecration of Uyghur cemeteries to eradicate any trace of their identity, the deliberate separation of family members, propagandized re-education, and their exploitation as forced labour. Indeed, the Noble Baroness, the Minister, drew my attention to an article in The Economist setting out the scale and the nature of what is being done. We all, my lords, we all need to have a better understanding of what it really means when we see a label that says "Made in China." Who made it? How was it made? And under what conditions was it made? By way of exchange with the Noble Baroness, I would draw her attention to an article in The Spectator which appeared on January the 23rd. It was written by Harold Muss. He gives the example of Coca-Cola's production plant, which he says is, quotes, a joint venture with a Chinese state company surrounded by prisons and re-education camps in which China suppresses local ethnic minorities. Within 30 kilometres of that plant, there are 25 prisons and internment camps. In the whole of Xinjiang, there are at least 380 internment camps, some of which have huge structures and watchtowers, barbed wire, and thousands of inmates. An analysis of satellite imagery suggests that there are crematoria in at least 9 of them. The Chinese Communist Party says that the camps are educational and training facilities. Precisely what purpose does a crematorium have in an educational facility? Uyghurs are forced to work for factories or farms making products, some of which are sold in the United Kingdom. Over the past 2 years, work programs have been significantly enlarged, with official statistics showing that 2.6 million surplus rural workers in Xinjiang were relocated within 1 year, an increase of 46%. In July, the government responded to the concerns expressed about both the use of slave labour and the security challenges by announcing that they would be removing Huawei from the UK's 5G mobile network. UK mobile providers have been banned from buying new Huawei 5G equipment, and they'll have to remove all of its 5G kit by 2027. I think the government's decision is the right one, and they've taken notice of the concerns which were raised during the debate in your Lordship's House. In December, it went on to publish the 5G supply chain diversification strategy, and I also welcome that. But the government had gone further. Last week, Dominic Raab announced more plans to outlaw Chinese imports which can be linked to human rights abuse, and there will be fines and possible sanctions against companies which are connected to slave labour. He told the House of Commons that he'd been shocked by, his words, the industrial scale of the forced labour and the concentration camps, saying that he had never again expected to see pictures of people being herded like animals onto trains to take them away from kith and kin, to be enslaved and stripped of their humanity. Such echoes from a terrible past have also been heard in reports of human hair taken from the shaved heads of Uyghur people, exported to be used in wigs by those who sadly seem equally comfortable wearing fashion items made by Uyghur slaves. We await news, my lords, from Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon about how Magnitsky sanctions will be used against senior Chinese Communist Party officials who've overseen these programs of mass incarceration, and perhaps the Noble Baroness can give the House further information about when such action will be taken. It's instructive that the US government has already imposed sanctions and restrictions against 48 Chinese companies suspected of using forced labour or providing technical assistance to the suppression system of Xinjiang, described by the US Congress as, I quote, the largest mass incarceration of a minority population in the world. Adrian Zentz, a leading authority on Xinjiang, estimates that most of today's cotton in Xinjiang is picked under forced labour conditions and with minimal payments. And I particularly pay tribute to the BBC for highlighting this in a documentary recently. Zentz says more than 500,000 Uyghurs, probably whether they want to or not, are being sent by the state to the fields for 3 months, with brands including Hugo Boss, Adidas, Muji, Uniqlo, Costco, Caterpillar, Lacoste, Ralph Lauren and Tommy Hilfiger have been named in reports linking them to Xinjiang factories or materials. 1 in 5 cotton products worldwide is made with Xinjiang cotton. To its credit, Marks & Spencer have pledged to stop using any cotton from Xinjiang. My Lords, next week, on Tuesday, the House will be asked to vote again on the all-party genocide amendment to the trade bill, which was passed in your Lordship's House by a formidable majority of 126, and in the House of Commons with the equally formidable support of the former leader of the Conservative Party, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, Ms Ghani, Member of Parliament, and other senior figures from the government benches. It came within 11 votes of achieving a majority. The movers of that amendment in both houses have listened to constructive suggestions and have modified the amendment which now stands in lieu and is on our order paper. There is no greater abuse of human rights than genocide. It is, my lords, the crime above all crime. No other word adequately describes a state complicit in the destruction of a people's identity, complicit in mass surveillance, complicit in forced labour and in forced slavery, complicit in the uprooting of people, the destruction of communities and families, the prevention of births, the ruination of cemeteries where generations of loved ones have been buried. It's the only word to describe a state which seeks to re-educate you so that you will believe that you, your people, your religion, your culture never existed, and the certainty that through ethno-religious cleansing you will cease to exist in the future. Last week I read the testimony of Sairagul Sautabe, a woman who escaped from one of the camps. She said, "Some prisoners were hung on the wall and beaten with electrified truncheons. There were prisoners who were made to sit on a chair of nails. I saw people return covered in blood. Some came back without fingernails. One elderly woman's skin had been flayed." She said, "Some prisoners were hung on the wall and beaten with electrified truncheons." She said that the prisoners are used for medical experiments. Quote, "Some of the men become sterile. Women are routinely raped." On the same day that the House of Commons voted on the genocide amendment from your Lordship's House, the incoming and outgoing US administrations both declared events in Xinjiang to be a genocide. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said at his confirmation hearing in the US Senate, and I quote, "On the Uyghurs, I think we're very much in agreement, and the forcing of men and women and children into concentration camps, trying to in effect re-educate them to be adherents to the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, all of that speaks to an effort to commit genocide." My Lords, there will be a division on that amendment on Tuesday, and I have no wish to try the patience of the House. I'm reluctant to divide the House again today, but before making a final decision, I would like to hear from the Minister why the judicial route to determining genocide is being resisted by the government when it says that only a court can make such a determination, and when distinguished jurists, including members of your Lordship's House, including 2 former Supreme Court judges and the former Lord Chief Justice, when they say there is no practical impediment to such determinations being made by our British courts. In her letter to peers of January the 26th, the Noble Baroness makes no mention of when the government intends to bring forward legislation to enhance the provisions of the 2015 Act and to tackle supply chain transparency. She'll recall that I've specifically asked her what response British Telecom have given her about how they intend to meet their legal obligations, and I will listen carefully to what she has to say about those issues, especially when we can expect to see movement from the Home Office. My Lords, I will, as always, listen carefully to the debate and to the Noble Baroness, but I do recognise the efforts that she has genuinely made. I beg to move.